Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Lord Mayor, thank you for welcoming us all. We feel very welcome indeed, and it's wonderful to be here with such a significant group of leaders as part of the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue, and I particularly wanted to acknowledge the irrepressible Chris Brown and thank him for his invitation and his leadership as part of this event as well. I speculate on the title out there. I suppose some years ago that may have been a reflection on where Parramatta and Western Sydney was perceived in relation to the centre, but actually I think now it's in reverse, that out there refers to areas other than Western Sydney, because increasingly from a demographic perspective, from an activity perspective, and increasingly in terms of commercial centre, Parramatta and Western Sydney is increasingly the centre, and everywhere else has become out there. But as Rebecca has already indicated, it is really terrific that this summit is beginning on a note of education, because in any society, any civilisation, any culture throughout history, the key enabler for human opportunity and innovation and compassion is at its root education. Education is foundational for everything. So it's wonderful that it is clearly appreciated by the organisers of this summit that education has a foundational role in providing opportunity for human development, opportunity for justice, opportunity for investment, opportunity for prosperity. And it would be remiss of me as Education Minister not to begin by providing a little bit of a statistical overview of the tremendous amount of investment happening in education throughout Western Sydney in particular. Right now, this year alone, we are seeing $220 million of capital invested in 13 specific projects in Western Sydney. That is part over the next 4 years of 67 individual school projects, either new schools, retrofits or renovations to existing schools, or major expansions of those schools, totalling $1.5 billion, out of a total unprecedented amount of $4.2 billion over the next 4 years. That's more money than has ever been invested in school infrastructure by any New South Wales government in history. And the reason for that is because of the enormous growth that we are seeing and the great opportunities that is providing. To make that story even more compelling, we saw today statistics that indicate the continuing choice that parents are making to prefer public education. Ever since 2011, we have seen the turnaround in a long-term decline in public primary school enrolments, and that is continuing. So now that we have 45,000 additional children in New South Wales public schools, but we are also seeing a turnaround in the decline in secondary public school enrolments as well. And I believe that this will be sustained, and that creates even greater challenges and even greater opportunities. But of course, building schools is only one part of the equation. Really, it's what goes on inside the schools is where the real relational magic of creating opportunities for young people really happens. And that is why the government has, as part of being the first state to sign up to the Gonski funding reforms, is seeing unprecedented amounts of flexible funding flowing into schools across Western Sydney. This year alone, we are seeing $219 million in flexible funding in schools in Western Sydney, additional to anything that was expected or anticipated. And the reason that that funding is so important is it recognises, again, for the first time in Australian history, and this is what is so important about those Gonski reforms, that rather than providing block funding to independent schools or Catholic schools or public schools based on the number of enrolments, instead, the formula pierces those simplistic equations and looks instead at the identity of the children themselves and to their need. It is blind as to where the children might go to school. It's blind to who might operate the sector. Instead, it looks at the needs of the children and applies the funding to them. So in the case, just to pick one example, Westfield Sports High, Roger Davis, the principal there, this year has an additional $610,000 to provide in flexible funding, together with his school community and his school leaders, to identify where the need is within the cohort of students at Westfield at the moment. That's a complex and diverse school, and to apply flexible funding, not ordered by head office as to where it must go, not mandated or tied in any way, but to look at the needs of the students in classrooms today and identify what their particular needs are. Is it in literacy? Is it in numeracy? Are there specific issues in mental health that need to be addressed? There is an additional $610,000 over and above the increasing amount of base funding in flexible funding to meet the needs of those students. And we believe that that is absolutely crucial to ensure that every student in that school has every opportunity that might be available to them. We often talk in terms of helping young people reach their potential, but in so many ways that way of thinking is objectionable because it presupposes, it assumes what that student's potential might be. By applying flexible funding in consultation with teachers and parents and school communities, we can help build potential, because we know that with every human that we continue to develop and that our potential continually expands. But back to school building, because obviously that's a focus of so much of the activity that we'll be talking about later in the day. In school building alone, we can see wherever in Sydney you might come from, you will pass your local schools and they fall into 4 distinct periods of development. There were the schools that were provided after the Public Education Act of 1866 was passed. They were grand edifices that speak to the importance, the almost monumentalism of the era, that spoke that the importance of civic leaders of the time attached to school-based education, and the longevity of those structures speaks to the huge significance that was accorded to public education in the later 19th century. Then through the 1920s was the next big period of school building, those grand fenestrations, high ceilings, voluminous, flexible classroom spaces. Again, no expense was spared on the building of the schools themselves, and today they continue to provide flexible, airy learning spaces for young people. But then we seemed to go backwards and we lost our way. Perhaps it was because we were reacting to a huge growth in demand in the post-war period, and you saw, after the introduction of the Wyndham scheme in the early 1960s, this massive focus on school building according to templatised designs created by the New South Wales Government Architects Office. Many of you would be familiar with the so-called donut schools of the time. And this is where the mass production of standardised, functional demountables started to inveigle their way into the education system to meet demand. The priorities of the time were cost and time, because of the huge weight of students that had not been effectively anticipated nor planned for. The next stage of school building was really the BER, only a decade or so ago. Again, an enormous program in terms of scale and cost, $3.5 billion. But as we now know, much of those school builds were overpriced and unwanted, and have left an unfunded legacy of maintenance liabilities for which no provision was made, so that parents and taxpayers today are having to compensate for the unwise investments made by previous generations. And it's ironic when we look at the older schools built 100 years or more ago, you find flexibility, you find space, you find shading, you find ventilation, you find all the great things that create really healthy, productive learning environments. And somehow, over the past few decades, we have lost our way. That has created complex and costly maintenance challenges for us, and we know we can do better. So in the priorities for school infrastructure in New South Wales and the opportunity presented by an unprecedented 4.2 building opportunity, capital opportunity, we are not going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Instead, we will learn from the successes of the past. Instead of creating templatised, sterile, one-size-fits-all design. We are spending more on design. We are consulting with communities through project reference groups as to what the needs of students are now and what they are likely to be in the future. We are building in flexibility. We are also bringing back that concept of monumentalism, that we need to be saying through our architecture the importance that we attach to public education. We want future generations to know that this generation counted education as foundational in terms of human development and human justice. And we want the schools that we are building right now to be a legacy to the wisdom of the current generation, to the magnanimity of the current generation, and to the idea that every child deserves the best start in life possible. That's why we're investing so much more in quality teaching, but also in quality school buildings as well. And we make no apology for spending more on design, for taking our time to make sure that we get these builds right, because we know that this is literally, and this is an oft abused phrase, but it literally is a once in a generation, or perhaps a once in two generation opportunity. It's a fantastic opportunity. I know many in the room will be engaged in designing, equipping and working in the schools that we are developing now. And my urge to you is to thirst for the same sort of excellence in providing, equipping and working in these structures that we expect of the students learning in them. Winston Churchill once said, "We shape our buildings thereafter they shape us." And no truer is that statement than in reference to public education. We want our buildings to send a message to the students who learn and play and relate in them, that we are acting with excellence, we are providing you with excellence, and we want you to have those same opportunities to exercise and exhibit excellence in your own lives. It's a terrific opportunity. I thank every single one of you in this room for your engagement, for your leadership. I note my parliamentary colleague, the Shadow Minister, Jihad Dib, who I know has a similar view in relation to the centrality of getting school builds right and ensuring that we provide in a bipartisan way for the entire community, because we know that whatever our beliefs, whatever the vision we have for our own futures, we all appreciate that equity and excellence in education is foundational and helpful for all of us. Thanks a lot.
Imagine if we got a Minister for Education and knew a thing or two about education. He also knows a thing or two about planning, and I think importantly on Rob's watch is the fact that planning and education will be so well linked. Minister, before I thank you and to toast our educators, just to make a couple of questions for you. You've had a big week. You've been tilting at windmills all over the place on education. Let me go back towards that combination of your former planning role and your current education role. Probably one of the worst kept secrets in government is the government's going to struggle a bit on their infill targets, the commission for the inner ring of Sydney, the complaints at Ryde or Canterbury or Hurstville and all over the place, maybe even in the Northern Beaches every so often, about too many apartments, too much density, means that probably the West is going to get even more of the load, which we're a generous people. We're happy to continue to be the solution to Sydney's problem. But does that mean we're going to get even more schools, even more hospital beds and even more train lines to accommodate that growth?
The simple answer is yes, and that is the point of planning and planning in an integrated way. The Premier has presided over something really significant, which is the first time, again in history, that the metropolitan plans, the infrastructure plans and the transport plans have been developed in lockstep with one another. And the point of targets is that, again, it was a tough decision to put targets out there. Politically, it was, in Sir Humphrey's word, courageous to put numbers around where we need to go if we are going to accommodate Sydney's burgeoning population. But if we don't put the numbers out there, and if we don't have if we're not honest about the growth that is coming, we will fail to plan for it, and we will be left in the situation that we find ourselves in currently because of a lack of planning in the past. We need to do the planning now and get it right, and we are doing it. And that means that the infrastructure needs to be provided at the same time. People, and I know there's going to be a debate about this later on today, and I'm upset I'm not able to see it because it'll be fabulously entertaining.
Dick Smith versus Dave Borgia, rounds 1 to 3.
Yeah, I should write a book on it. But the problem has been in this city, ideas of growth need to be recoupled with the idea of human progress. That growth actually makes people's lives better, provides more opportunities. And when we see growth where a minority benefit and a majority are left behind, well, people can't see the sense in that growth. It's putting the two things together.
So you touched on demountables. My wonderful school, Cumberland High at Carlingford, school burnt down 3 weeks into my year 7, and there were still demountables when I finished HSC in '83. You also pay tribute to Anthony Manning and the school's infrastructure team, who are 50 plus schools across Western Sydney, is a remarkable rollout, and new schools. You copped a bit of flack when Wentworth Point opened recently because it wasn't air conditioned. Can we be too cool for school? Can we get a part of Sydney that is 10 degrees warmer on days compared to the east, doesn't get the sea breeze? Will air conditioning be standard, or can we also in design work for ways to cool schools so that kids don't have to swelter through algebra?
Yeah. So a couple of points here. I mean, the first thing is this is an area where it's easy to be populist, it's easy to engage in quick sloganeering. But the answer to these questions are far more complex than buying a bunch of imported air conditioners and putting them up in schoolrooms. You have to think about the long-term operating costs of this infrastructure. You also have to think about what's a healthy school environment, and actually hermeneutically sealing a classroom and then controlling temperature through artificial means is by no means the best way to ensure that schools are comfortable and that thermal comfort is provided for. Because there are similar issues in relation to heating on the other side of the ledger as well. Part of the problem is because proper thought wasn't put into design, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, so that we have schools that operate inefficiently. In many of these cases, and some of the schools we are replacing are those because the classrooms were not well built in the first place. They've got problems with damp, which creates its own health challenges, or there are long-term problems in terms of the performance of these buildings. To design buildings properly to reduce the need for artificial heating and cooling is the first thing to do. And then by all means, no amount of good design is going to obviate extremes of heat or cold, and then we look to mechanical solutions. But my instinctive thought, and again the research tells us, that should not be the first place to look at, because we look at the BER, for example. None of those structures were air conditioned, many of which now we have to retrofit those sorts of air conditioning solutions in at the same time as there was no provisioning for the ongoing maintenance of these buildings. So it's a complex challenge, but it's one that we can meet, and one we can meet through focusing on good design from the outset.
Well, it falls me to formally thank the Minister as well, and we have, let me first knock that off, because we have a bloke as Education Minister, and I think he made the point, gee, how Dib, there's not a lot between these two guys. Education is going okay when they're a little too matey for my style of, good combative politics, because they sort of agree on a fair bit of the policy stream. But that's a good thing for all of us, because it means a continuity regardless of electoral cycles. But a guy who gets both the supply and demand issues, that he's tilting at windmills on curricula, on NAPLAN, on the rise of selective schools, and is that actually fighting against private schools or simply hurting comprehensive state schools? Who understands, I think one of the rare things he and Alan Jones probably agree on is, should 5-year-olds be taking home an hour, 2 hours worth of homework a night, and should working families have to stretch to pay for coaching to get the kids into schools? How about we let kids at 5, 6, 7 and 8 just enjoy being a kid for a while, which would be nice. At the same time, he's recognising the infrastructure burst that we need in a growth community, so it's fantastic. But In thanking the Minister more particularly, I thought the best way to thank him would be to toast the educators of this region. He's particularly noted Eddie Wu in recent times and put him to great teacher of Cherrybrook who's taking maths to the world. Didn't help much with me. I got less than 20% in HSC in maths, but I could have done with Eddie Wu in my life. He also presides over the Public Schools, the Talent Development Project, which my father, Honourable J.J. Brown, former member of Parramatta, has joined us as one of the patrons to take kids in public schools in New South Wales to the world. Human Nature, who one of the greatest exports. People who've come through that program, and a lot of his students are also ex-students are now running the Bankstown Poetry Slam you'll hear from later today. But I wanted to, and there's some of the people in the room, I'd love to formally recognise on behalf of the dialogue some of these great educators of Western Sydney, because recognising how important it is to us as a community for education as a way out for communities. Not everybody's disadvantaged in Western Sydney, but we have more disadvantaged people anywhere else in Sydney, and education is the key to that. So as I say, please stand up and take a worthy applause from your community. First, a couple of teachers who were named in the National 2018 Teaching Awards. Stacey Quince from Campbelltown Performing Arts High. Stacey's principal teamed up with global tech companies and London Education Think Tank Innovation Unit to help the 1,100 students to think globally and act locally, with more students now completing the HSC and going on to the tertiary studies, often first in their families. Thanks to Stacey. To Peter Gurrier-Jones from the Hills School in Northmead, principal of the school. I don't know how that ponytail goes in Northmead, but I'd love to send it to my principal. Northmead caters for 113 students with developmental disabilities and complex learning needs. He developed the communication passport, which gives teachers, families and students a clear picture of individual student skills and abilities, and measured against curriculum requirements. Thank you. To the great Linda O'Brien, Dr. Linda O'Brien. Principal of Granville Boys High and a recent entrant to our board of Western Sydney University. Named as one of Australia's 10 most influential women in 2014 and winner of the regional category of the 2014 AFR Westpac Women of Influence Award. Linda's over 20 years of working with boys from marginalised communities, boys from low socioeconomic status and from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. She presides over a school that used to beat us up every week in footy, Granville Boys. Tough school, great principal. Thank you, Linda. To David Lovell from Padstow TAFE, Padstow Horticulture TAFE. Where's David? Over there. David, and I recognise John Black, the Managing Director of TAFE, so you're probably good for a pay rise into this, David. David's an outstanding classroom teacher, acknowledged by his student, peers and industry, qualified industry recognised expert across landscape construction and arboriculture. I think that's to do with trees. He's a World Skills Landscape Construction Coach and former recipient of the New South Wales Premier's Award for Teaching. Thanks, David. I know John Spradrow can't be with us, the principal of Holy Family Primary School in Edmonton, out of the Catholic education system, because there was a problem at the school yesterday and he didn't turn up to get the gong and the recognition. He stayed home to look after his students, and we recognise that. But his work in Edmonton, right downtown Mount Druitt, has been remarkable and well recognised through Catholic Ed and amongst his peers. And lastly, amongst this motley crew, a guy called Professor James Arvanatakis at the back there, the rock star babyface professor at WSU. Look at him, he turned 50 last week, unbelievable. Dean of the Graduate School of Research and a Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research and Graduate Studies. James is founding head of the WSU Academy, and we welcome so many Academy students here with us today who are working as student volunteers in our program. He's recognised for his innovative teaching style with the 2012 Prime Minister's University Teacher of the Year Award, and an adornment to that. I also, as the Minister said, one other teacher, ex-teacher is in the room, is Jihad Dib, the Shadow Minister for Education. Famously was the former principal of Punchbowl High and turned around one of the, at that stage, least functional schools in the state into one of its proudest boasts. So Jihad, also welcome to you. Can I ask, Minister, on behalf of the dialogue as of this year and working through DPC in your department, we're launching a a scholarship program, Dialogue Scholarship Program, providing 10 $1,000 scholarships to kids at high school whose family needs some support to get them to TAFE and to get them to university. So we won't set up massive infrastructure. We'll happily tag in behind your program. Just the kids of Western Sydney who need $1,000 is going to make a difference for a computer or something to help maintain that push through to school. So, in closing, in toasting those educators, we think that's the greatest way we can thank our Minister for Education for the role both schools infrastructure and the department, supply and demand, policy and hardware are recognising that in a growth area like Western Sydney, education is fundamental to it. Minister, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your support.